Sometimes the measure of a man isn't what he keeps, but what he gives away when he has nothing left to give. In the fading light of the Old West, Ezekiel Ward was down to his last possession, a horse named Mercy. When he found two Apache sisters stranded in the desert, dying of thirst, he didn't hesitate. He gave them his horse, knowing it meant he'd walk back to town with nothing. That night, sleeping under cold stars, he heard thunder in the distance. But at dawn it wasn't a storm that arrived. It was their father, an Apache war chief, leading 200 horses across the desert plain. What happens when a broken man's last act of kindness becomes his greatest reward? Before we ride into this story, tell us where you're watching from. And if this tale touches your heart, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow brings something truly special. The desert stretched out in all directions like an ocean of sand and sage, painted in shades of copper and gold beneath the relentless New Mexico sun. Ezekiel Ward, most folks just called him Zeke, sat atop his buckskin mare at the edge of Redemption Springs, a town so small it barely warranted a name. He was 58 years old, though the sun and wind had carved lines into his face that made him look older. His hands, rough as old leather, rested easy on the saddle horn. Those hands had built a life once. Now they held onto the reins of his last remaining piece of it. The mare beneath him was called Mercy, and she was the color of late summer grass, with a black mane and tail that caught the light like silk. She wasn't much to look at by some standards. Not a fancy show horse or a powerful quarter horse built for cutting cattle. But she had a gentle eye and a patient spirit, and she'd carried Zeke through some of his darkest years without complaint. He'd owned her for 12 years now, since she was a filly, and in all that time she'd never once thrown him or refused a command. She was steady, reliable, more loyal than most people he'd known. The saddle cinched to her back was something else entirely, a memorial to better days. It was a working saddle, the kind a real cowboy earned through years in the trade, made of thick leather that had been tooled with intricate designs of running horses and desert flowers. The maker's mark was still visible on the cantle, handcrafted by Samuel Ward, 1871, his father. Zeke ran his thumb over the mark sometimes when he was alone, remembering the man who'd taught him to rope and ride, who'd believed a cowboy's worth was measured in honest work and keeping your word. The leather was worn now, darkened by sweat and weather, the silver conchos tarnished green. But it still held together, still served its purpose. Like Zeke himself, it refused to quit. He nudged Mercy forward into town, such as it was. Redemption Springs consisted of one main street of packed dirt, flanked by weather-beaten buildings that leaned slightly as if tired of standing upright. There was Old Pete's General Store, the Watering Hole Saloon, Maria's Cantina, a livery stable, a blacksmith, and a modest adobe church that seemed to shrink a little more each year as fewer people attended. At the far end of town stood the bank, a two-story structure that Mr. Thornton had built to look important, complete with white-painted trim, and a sign that read Redemption Springs Bank and Trust in letters that were flaking away. Zeke tied Mercy outside Old Pete's store and stepped up onto the weathered boardwalk. His boots, resoled twice and still holding on, made hollow sounds on the wood. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the familiar smell of leather, tobacco, and dried goods greeted him like an old friend. Zeke, Pete nodded from behind the counter. He was a compact man in his 70s, with a beard gone completely white and eyes that had seen the territory change from wild frontier to something tamer, though he'd never quite decided if that was good or bad. Got that delivery job for you, if you're still interested? I'm interested. Zeke approached the counter, removing his hat out of habit. His hair, once dark as coffee, had gone iron gray, and he kept it long enough to tuck behind his ears. Pete pushed a folded paper across the worn wood. Need you to ride out to the Triple R Ranch. Old man Rutherford needs this message delivered, says it's time-sensitive. You can't trust the mail coach. They've been running late, and the telegraph line's down again. He paused, studying Zeke with concern that went deeper than business. It's a 2-day ride out there, maybe 3 coming back. You got supplies enough? Zeke glanced at the paper, then back at Pete. "I'll manage." "What's the pay?" $5. "I know it ain't much. It's honest work, Pete. I'll take it." $5 would buy him enough cornmeal, beans, and coffee to last a couple weeks if he was careful. Maybe a new shirt if there was anything left over. His current one had been patched so many times it was more patch than original fabric. Pete reached under the counter and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Maria asked me to give you this. She said don't argue about it, just take it." Zeke unwrapped the bundle to find fresh tortillas, some dried beef, and a handful of dried apples. His throat tightened. "I can't keep taking charity, Pete. It ain't charity when friends look after each other." Pete's voice was firm but kind. "You'd do the same if situations were reversed, and you know it. Besides, Maria's got more food than she knows what to do with. You're doing her a favor." They both knew that wasn't quite true, but Zeke nodded his acceptance. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. "Thank you." "Tell her thank you. Tell her yourself. She's probably over at the cantina right now, getting ready for the evening crowd." Pete hesitated, then added, "Zeke, I know things have been hard, but you're a good man. Don't let anyone in this town tell you different." Zeke settled his hat back on his head. "Hard to feel good when you've got nothing to show for 60 years of living. You've got mercy, and you've got people who care about you. That's more than nothing." Pete's expression softened. "I remember when you first came to Redemption Springs. Must have been, 25 years ago? You and Sarah just married, full of plans. You built that ranch with your own hands, raised those beautiful girls. The fever that took them, that wasn't your fault. Zeke, neither was losing everything trying to save them." The mention of his family hit Zeke like a physical blow. Even after 15 years, Sarah, Lily, and Rose, his twin daughters, 8 years old, when the fever came through the territory like wildfire. He'd sold everything, cattle, land, the house itself, to pay doctors who couldn't help. He'd watched them slip away one by one. First Lily, then Rose 3 days later, then Sarah a week after that. The fever had taken nearly a quarter of the territory that summer, but that didn't make his grief any smaller. He'd been left with nothing but debts, memories, and a saddle his father had made. That was a long time ago. "Pete," Zeke's voice was rough. "Not so long that you've forgiven yourself." Pete met his eyes directly. "Maybe it's time you did." Zeke didn't answer. He picked up the message for the R Ranch, tucked Maria's food parcel into his saddlebag, and stepped back out into the afternoon heat. The sun was starting its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Zeke crossed the street to Maria's cantina, a low adobe building with a covered porch, where a few men sat drinking beer and playing cards. They nodded to him as he passed, and he nodded back. There was no animosity in Redemption Springs toward Zeke Ward, just a kind of sad understanding. Everyone knew his story. In a town this small, you couldn't hide your past. Maria was inside, stirring a large pot of pozole that filled the room with the scent of hominy and chili. She was a widow herself, somewhere in her 50s, with streaks of silver in her dark hair and a direct way of speaking that Zeke appreciated. When she saw him, she set down her wooden spoon and wiped her hands on her apron. "Ezekiel Ward, you better not be coming in here to thank me for that food. Pete already gave me the lecture about accepting help." Zeke managed a small smile. "But I am grateful, Maria. You've helped me fix my roof twice and never took a cent. You've chopped wood for me when my back was hurting. You always treat people with respect, even when they don't deserve it." She ladled pozole into a bowl without asking if he wanted any. "Sit down and eat before you ride out. Pete told me about the delivery job." Zeke sat at one of the rough wooden tables and accepted the bowl. The pozole was rich and warming, exactly what he needed before a long journey. Maria brought him fresh tortillas and sat across from him, her hands folded on the table. "How long will you be gone?" 5-6 days, maybe. Depends on how fast I can make the ride." He broke off a piece of tortilla. "The R is way out past Devil's Canyon. Remote country. Be careful out there. I heard there's been trouble with bandits on the eastern trails. I'll stick to the old routes, the ones nobody uses anymore." He ate slowly, savoring each bite. It had been 2 days since his last real meal. Besides, what would bandits want from me? I've got nothing worth stealing except mercy, and she'd throw anyone who wasn't me. Maria's expression turned serious. You've got your life, Zeke. That's worth something, even if you don't believe it right now. He met her eyes, saw the genuine concern there, and felt that familiar ache in his chest. People like Maria and Pete, they were good folk. They deserved better than to waste their kindness on a broken-down cowboy who'd lost everything that mattered. But he didn't say that. Instead, he finished his meal, thanked her properly, and stepped back out into the fading light. Mercy nickered softly when he approached, as if asking if he was all right. He stroked her neck, feeling the warmth of her through his palm. Just you and me, girl. Same as always. He swung up into that worn saddle, felt it settle familiar beneath him, and pointed Mercy east toward the open desert. Behind him, Redemption Springs grew smaller until it was just a smudge on the horizon. Ahead lay nothing but wilderness, sky, and the long road to the Triple R Ranch. The desert in late afternoon was a place of harsh beauty. Shadows stretched long from every rock and cactus, turning the landscape into a study of light and dark. Roadrunners darted across the trail. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals. The air smelled of creosote and dust, that distinctive scent of the Southwest that got into your lungs and stayed there. Zeke rode at an easy pace, letting Mercy set her own rhythm. There was no hurry. The message would get there when it got there, and rushing across the desert was a good way to kill a horse. He'd learned that lesson young, watching a greenhorn cowboy push his mount too hard in the heat. The horse had collapsed and never gotten back up. A good cowboy respected his animal, understood it was a partnership, not ownership. As the sun touched the horizon, Zeke began looking for a place to camp. He found a spot where 3 large boulders formed a natural windbreak, with enough scrub nearby to give Mercy something to nibble on after he'd given her grain from his saddlebag. He unsaddled her, rubbed her down with a cloth, and hobbled her loosely so she could move around but not wander off. Then he built a small fire from dead mesquite wood, just enough to boil water for coffee and warm Maria's tortillas. He ate simply, sitting on his bedroll with his back against stone, still warm from the day's sun. The stars began to appear, first one by one, then in great sweeping clusters that filled the sky from horizon to horizon. This was the part of the day Zeke both loved and dreaded. The solitude. In the silence of the desert night, there was nowhere to hide from memory. He thought about Sarah, the way she'd laugh at his bad jokes, how she'd braid their daughter's hair every morning, singing softly. He thought about Lily, so serious and thoughtful, always asking questions about how things worked. And Rose, wild and joyful, who'd wanted to be a cowboy like her papa when she grew up. They'd been gone 15 years, but the grief was still there, a constant weight he carried like that worn saddle. Some days it was bearable. Other days it threatened to crush him. Tonight, under the vast, indifferent stars, it was simply there, a part of him as essential as breathing. He poured the last of his coffee onto the fire and watched the embers hiss and die. Then he laid out his bedroll, pulled his blanket up to his chin, and let the desert darkness take him. Tomorrow would bring another sunrise, another day of riding, another day of existing in the space between who he'd been and who he'd become. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out and another answered. The sound was lonely and haunting, perfectly suited to the empty places. Zeke closed his eyes and let sleep come, not knowing that tomorrow would bring the moment that changed everything. The sun was already punishing by mid-morning, turning the air thick and heavy. Zeke had been riding since first light, following the old trail that wound through a landscape of red rock and endless sage. Mercy plodded steadily beneath him, her ears forward, alert but calm. They'd covered maybe 15 miles since breaking camp, and Zeke figured they'd reach a water source by early afternoon, if his memory served him right. That's when he saw the buzzards. 3 of them circled lazily in the sky ahead, their dark wings spread wide against the blue. Every cowboy knew what that meant. Something was dying or already dead. Zeke's stomach tightened, but he kept Mercy moving forward. Could be a coyote, a deer, even a cow wandered off from some distant ranch. But there was a chance, a slim one. It might be something else. As he drew closer, the landscape changed. An old creek bed cut through the terrain, its banks lined with withered cottonwoods that hadn't seen water in months. The creek itself was nothing but cracked mud and scattered stones. And there, in the shade of the largest tree, he saw them, two small figures unmoving. Zeke urged Mercy into a trot, his heart hammering against his ribs. As he approached, details came into focus. Children, two girls, lying side by side in the dirt. They wore simple dresses made of buckskin, decorated with beadwork. Their dark hair was dusty and tangled. Apache, he realized, and young, maybe 8 and 10 or 10 and 12. It was hard to tell with children you didn't know. He dismounted before Mercy had fully stopped, his knees protesting the sudden movement. Up close, he could see the girls were breathing, but barely. Their lips were cracked and bleeding. Their skin had the dangerous flush of severe dehydration. One of them, the older one, had her arm wrapped protectively around the younger girl, even in unconsciousness. "Easy now," Zeke said softly, kneeling beside them. "I'm here to help. Can you hear me?" The older girl's eyelids fluttered. She tried to speak, but only managed a dry rasp. Her eyes, when they opened, were dark and filled with fear. She tried to pull her sister closer, protective even in this state. "Water," Zeke said, holding up his canteen where she could see it. "Agua, I have water." He uncapped the canteen and carefully lifted the girl's head, tipping a small amount of water between her lips. Not too much. He'd seen men drown themselves drinking too fast after severe thirst. She swallowed reflexively, coughed, then took another small sip. Her eyes focused on him more clearly now, still afraid but desperate. "Your sister," Zeke said, gesturing. "Let me give her water too." The girl nodded weakly and released her grip. Zeke moved to the younger child and repeated the process. This one was in worse shape, her breathing shallow and rapid. But she swallowed the water, and her eyes opened briefly before closing again. Zeke sat back on his heels, assessing the situation. These girls were in serious trouble. The nearest water source was at least 20 miles back the way he'd come. The Triple R ranch was still 2 days ahead. And by the look of them, these children wouldn't survive another few hours in this heat without help. He scanned the area and spotted it then, a small beaded bracelet lying in the dirt a few yards away, its thread broken. The beads were arranged in a pattern that looked like running horses. He picked it up, turning it over in his weathered hands, and something twisted in his chest. His daughters had worn bracelets like this. Sarah had made them sitting by lamplight, her fingers quick and sure with needle and thread. Lily and Rose had been about these ages when the fever took them. The older girl was trying to sit up now, and Zeke helped her, letting her take another careful drink. She spoke in Apache, words he didn't fully understand, but her gesture was clear. She pointed to herself, then to her sister, then made a motion like galloping horses running away. Their mounts had spooked and left them. It happened. Horses were creatures of instinct, and something, a snake, a sudden sound, could send them bolting. "How long?" Zeke asked, holding up fingers, trying to make himself understood. "How many sons?" The girl held up 2 fingers, then seemed uncertain, added a third. 2, maybe 3 days. God, they'd been out here dying of thirst for that long. Zeke gave them more water, along with some of Maria's dried apples, which they ate slowly, carefully. He could see them getting stronger, their eyes clearer, their breathing more stable. But they were still desperately weak, and the day was only getting hotter. He looked at Mercy, standing patient in the sun. Then he looked at these 2 children, who reminded him so painfully of his own lost daughters. The math was simple and terrible. If he put both girls on Mercy and tried to walk them back to water, he might make it in time. Might not. And if one of them fell off, or if Mercy stumbled, they'd all be in trouble. But if he sent the girls back on Mercy alone, with directions, the horse would get them to safety. Mercy knew the way home. Horses had an instinct for it, and these girls, young as they were, clearly knew how to ride. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Zeke pulled out his knife, and the older girl flinched, but he moved slowly, showing her what he was doing. He drew in the dirt, a simple map. The trail, the water source, which he marked with wavy lines, the town, which he indicated with squares for buildings. He traced the path carefully, then pointed to Mercy, then to the girls, then to the town. "You take the horse," he said, speaking slowly and clearly, even though she might not understand the words. The meaning was in his gestures, his expression. "Follow the trail. Keep the sun at your back in the morning. You'll find water here." He tapped the drawing. "Then keep going to the town. People there will help you. You understand?" The girl stared at him for a long moment, and he saw the intelligence in her eyes, sharp despite her weakened state. She looked at Mercy, then at her sister, then back at Zeke. She spoke in Apache, a question he didn't need to understand to answer. "I'll be fine," he lied. "I can walk it, but your sister needs to get to safety now. You both do. Take the horse." He helped the older girl to her feet, and she swayed but held steady. Together they got the younger girl up. Zeke brought Mercy over and lifted the younger child into the saddle. She slumped forward, barely able to hold on. So Zeke positioned the older girl behind her, showing her how to hold her sister secure. "Just hold the reins gentle," he said, demonstrating. "She'll follow the trail on her own. Mercy's smart. She knows the way home. You just hold on and let her do the work." He tied his bedroll behind the saddle, along with his remaining food and water. Everything he had he gave them. He kept only his father's saddle, too heavy and too precious to send with them, which he set carefully on the ground along with the tack. The worn leather seemed to reproach him for this choice. The older girl looked down at him from Mercy's back, and tears cut tracks through the dust on her face. She spoke again in Apache, words that sounded like gratitude and apology mixed together. Then she touched her chest, said something that sounded like Ayana, then pointed to her sister and said what sounded like Elu. "Ezekiel," Zeke said, touching his own chest. "Folks call me Zeke." Ayana nodded solemnly, then looked ahead at the trail. Zeke gave Mercy a gentle slap on the hindquarters. "Go on, girl. Take them home. Go home." Mercy started walking, then moved into a gentle trot when Ayana clicked her tongue. Zeke watched them go, watched until they were just a small cloud of dust on the horizon, heading west toward Redemption Springs and safety. His last possession of any real value, carrying 2 children who reminded him of everything he'd lost. He stood there, in the shade of that dead cottonwood tree, until the desert had swallowed them completely. Then he picked up his father's saddle, hefted its familiar weight onto his shoulder, and started walking east. The Triple R Ranch was still 2 days away. On foot in this heat without water or food, it might as well have been on the moon, but he'd made his choice. And standing there, despite the fear and the certainty of suffering ahead, Zeke felt something he hadn't felt in years. Something that might have been peace. He'd saved 2 lives. If that was all he managed to do with what remained of his own, maybe that was enough. The sun climbed higher. The desert stretched endless in all directions, and Ezekiel Ward walked into it carrying a saddle and the weight of his memories. No longer certain he'd see another sunrise, but strangely content with the possibility that he might not. Night came eventually, as it always did. Zeke found a sheltered spot among some rocks and made camp without fire, without food, with nothing but the clothes on his back and that saddle for a pillow. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. His throat was parched, his feet blistered inside his boots, his body aching from the long walk, carrying weight in the heat. But when he finally closed his eyes, he slept better than he had in months. And in his dreams, he saw his daughters riding together on a buckskin mare, safe and laughing, heading toward a distant light. Zeke woke to the sound of thunder, which made no sense because the sky had been clear the night before. His body protested as he pushed himself upright, every muscle stiff and aching. The sun wasn't quite up yet, just the faint gray light of pre-dawn, but he could feel the rumble through the ground beneath him. Not thunder, horses. He stood slowly, bracing himself against the rock face, his vision swimming from dehydration and exhaustion. To the east, where the sky was starting to lighten, he saw it, a massive cloud of dust rising against the pale horizon. And beneath that cloud, movement, dark shapes emerging from the dimness, growing larger, more distinct, a herd. but not wild mustangs running free. These animals moved with purpose, with direction. And at the front, he could make out riders. Zeke's first thought was bandits, and his hand went instinctively to his hip, where his gun would have been if he hadn't left it with mercy. But as the shapes grew clearer in the strengthening light, he realized these weren't bandits. The lead rider sat tall on a paint horse, and behind him came others, and behind them a herd that seemed to stretch all the way to the horizon. Apache. His heart hammered in his chest. But he didn't run. Where would he go? And besides, if they meant him harm, there was nothing he could do about it. So he stood there, one hand on his father's saddle, and waited as the thunder of hooves grew louder and the ground trembled beneath his feet. The lead rider raised his hand, and the whole procession slowed, then stopped. Dust swirled around them, catching the first rays of sunlight and turning golden. The rider dismounted in one smooth motion and walked toward Zeke with measured steps. He was tall, maybe mid-40s, with long dark hair bound back and a face that carried the kind of authority that needed no words. He wore traditional Apache clothing mixed with practical cowboy gear, a combination that spoke of someone who lived between two worlds. Behind him, Zeke saw them. Hayana and Elu mounted on Mercy, looking healthy and whole. Relief flooded through him so intensely his knees nearly buckled. The man stopped a respectful distance away, studying Zeke with dark eyes that missed nothing. Then he spoke in English, his voice deep and measured. "You are the one called Ezekiel." It wasn't a question, but Zeke nodded anyway. "Yes, sir. Most folks call me Zeke. I am Tarek." He touched his chest, then gestured to the girls. "These are my daughters, Ayana, Elu. You saved their lives. I'm just glad they made it back safe. The horse, she's a good one. She knew the way." Zeke looked past Tarek to where Mercy stood and felt an ache in his chest. He'd made peace with never seeing her again. Having her here now, having saved those girls and gotten them home, felt like more than he deserved. Tarek turned and spoke in Apache to his daughters. Ayana slipped down from Mercy and approached carrying something. She stopped in front of Zeke and held out a single eagle feather, bound with leather cord. Her eyes were solemn as she spoke in her language, her tone formal. Tarek translated. "She says you showed honor. You gave everything when you had nothing. In our way, this is the greatest virtue. The feather is a symbol of this honor, of respect." Zeke took the feather with trembling hands. "I didn't do it for honor. I did it because—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "Because they reminded me of my daughters. Because I couldn't save my own girls, but I could save them. Because for once in my miserable life, I wanted to do something that mattered." "You did it because it was right," Tarek said simply. He gestured to the herd of horses stretching behind him. 200 horses. That is the value my daughters' lives hold to me. That is the debt I owe." Zeke's mouth went dry, and not just from thirst. He stared at the herd. Bays and paints, sorrels and greys, a few pintos, even a handful of Appaloosas with their distinctive spotted hindquarters. 200 horses. At even $20 a head, that was $4,000. More money than he'd seen in 15 years. "I can't," he started, but Tarek held up his hand. "In my people's way, a life debt must be honored. To refuse is to say their lives have no value. To refuse is an insult." His expression remained neutral, but there was steel beneath the words. "Would you insult me, Ezekiel Ward?" Zeke looked from Tarek to the horses to the eagle feather in his hand. His father had taught him that a man's worth was in his honor, in keeping his word. If Apache culture said this debt must be paid, who was he to say different? Who was he to dishonor these people by refusing? "No, sir," he said quietly. "I would not insult you." Something shifted in Tarek's expression, not quite a smile, but a softening. "My daughters say you walked to the Triple R Ranch. You were taking a message. That was the plan. Before I found the girls. And now? You walk still, but with no water, no food." Tarek's gaze was penetrating. "Why did you give them everything?" "Did you not think of yourself?" "I did think of myself," Zeke admitted, his voice rough. "I thought if I die out here, at least I died doing something decent. Something that mattered. I've wasted the last 15 years of my life grieving and feeling sorry for myself. Maybe this was a chance to mean something again. Tarek was silent for a long moment, studying him with those keen, dark eyes. Then he spoke in Apache to someone behind him, and a warrior came forward leading 2 horses, one saddled, one laden with supplies. The warrior handed the reins to Tarek, who then extended them to Zeke. "You give my daughter's life. I give you more than horses. I give you choice." Tarek's voice carried weight. "You can take 50 horses, sell them, have money, start new somewhere else. Or—" He paused, and Zeke saw something in his expression that looked almost like understanding, almost like kinship. "Or you can accept help rebuilding what you lost. Not just money, purpose." Zeke's hands shook as he took the reins. The horse was a sturdy roan gelding, solid and calm. The pack horse carried water bags, food, blankets, everything he'd need and more. "I lost my wife," Tarek said quietly. 5 winters passed, childbirth, the baby too. I know what it is to lose family, to feel like the ground opens beneath your feet and never closes." He met Zeke's eyes directly. "But I still have my daughters, and I have my people. A man alone is not complete. This is our way." "I don't know what to say," Zeke managed. "Say nothing now. Think on it. Deliver your message to the R, then come to Redemption Springs. We will be there 3 days. Then you decide, money or something more." Tarek turned to go, then stopped. "My daughters ask if they can give you something." Ayana and Elu approached together now, the younger girl leaning on her sister but walking on her own. They carried items wrapped in cloth, dried meat, bread, a water skin decorated with beadwork, and something else. A bridle, beautifully crafted, with silver conchos that caught the rising sun. "For mercy," Ayana said in careful English. "Thank you, Ezekiel Ward. Thank you for our lives." Zeke accepted the gifts, his throat too tight for words. He managed a nod, touched the brim of his hat to them in respect. Tarek mounted his paint horse in one fluid motion. 3 days, he repeated. Then he spoke in Apache a command, and the whole company began to move. The horses flowed around Zeke like a river, 200 animals and their riders, heading west toward Redemption Springs. Zeke stood there holding the reins of 2 horses and the gifts from 2 girls he'd saved, watching them disappear into the morning. The eagle feather lay against his chest, where he'd tucked it into his shirt pocket. His father's saddle sat on the ground beside him, waiting. He looked at the roan gelding, who gazed back at him with patient brown eyes, then at the eastern horizon, where the sun was now fully risen. The R ranch was still a day's ride ahead. But for the first time in 15 years, Ezekiel Ward felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't walking toward an ending. Maybe he was walking toward a beginning. The ride to the R ranch took the rest of that day and part of the next. Zeke traveled with food in his belly, water in his canteen, and 2 good horses beneath him. The contrast to his desperate walk just yesterday felt surreal, like waking from one dream into another. He kept touching the eagle feather in his pocket, making sure it was real, that any of this was real. Old man Rutherford met him at the ranch house, a sprawling adobe structure surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. Rutherford was in his 70s, weathered as driftwood, but his handshake was still firm and his eyes sharp. "Zeke Ward," he said, taking the message Pete had sent. "Been a long time since I've seen you. Heard you fell on hard times. That's one way to put it." Zeke removed his hat as Rutherford read the message, his lips moving slightly. Around them, ranch hands went about their work, moving cattle, mending fences, the daily rhythm of a working ranch. It was a life Zeke had known once, a life that felt impossibly distant now. "Pete says you're reliable," Rutherford said, folding the message and tucking it into his vest pocket. "Says you've been doing odd jobs, making ends meet." "Best I can." Rutherford studied him for a moment, then gestured toward the main house. "Come inside. Have supper with us before you head back. The wife would have my hide if I sent you off without a proper meal." They ate at a long wooden table. Zeke, Rutherford, his wife Emma, and their son Jack. A man in his 30s who ran the day-to-day operations now that his father was slowing down. The food was simple but plentiful. Beef, beans, fresh bread, coffee that was actually hot and strong. Emma was a kind woman who kept filling Zeke's plate despite his protests, and Jack talked about the challenges of modern ranching, the railroads changing shipping routes, the big cattle companies buying up land, the Apache troubles that had finally settled into an uneasy peace. "Speaking of Apache," Jack said, leaning back in his chair, "we heard there's a war party camped near Redemption Springs. Tarak's band. You see any sign of them on your way here?" Zeke set down his fork carefully. "I did, actually. Met them yesterday morning." The table went quiet. Emma's eyes widened slightly, and Rutherford leaned forward. "Met them? As in spoke to them?" "Yes, sir. Chief Tarak himself." Zeke pulled the eagle feather from his pocket and laid it on the table. "He gave me this." Jack whistled low. "That's an honor feather, Zeke. You don't get one of those for nothing." "What did you do?" "Found his daughters in the desert dying of thirst. Gave them my horse so they could get to safety." Zeke picked up the feather again, turning it in the lamplight. "He came to thank me. Brought 200 horses, 200. Rutherford's eyebrows shot up. "He's offering you 200 horses? For saving his daughters?" "Offering's not quite the right word. In his culture, a life debt has to be paid. Refusing would be an insult." Zeke tucked the feather away again. "He gave me 3 days to think on what I want to do with them. What you want to do." Jack shook his head in amazement. "Zeke, that's a fortune. You could sell half and still have enough to start over anywhere you wanted." "That's one choice," Zeke agreed. "Or I could try rebuilding my life back in Redemption Springs." That's what he suggested. Not just the horses, but help. Purpose, he called it. Emma spoke up for the first time, her voice gentle. "What do you want, Ezekiel?" It was such a simple question, but it struck him like a blow. What did he want? For 15 years, he'd wanted nothing except to forget the pain, to get through each day, to survive. The idea of actually wanting something, of planning for a future instead of just enduring the present, felt foreign and frightening. "I don't rightly know, Mom," he admitted. "Been a long time since I let myself want anything." Rutherford cleared his throat. "I remember when you and Sarah first came to these parts. You had dreams, Zeke, big ones. Built that ranch from nothing, raised it up to something worth having. Then the fever came." He paused, his expression sympathetic. "I also remember how Thornton handled your debts. Always thought that was a raw deal, the way he pushed you when you were at your lowest." "Water under the bridge," Zeke said. Though the mention of Thornton sent a familiar twist of bitterness through his gut, maybe so. "But bridges can be rebuilt too." Rutherford leaned forward, his voice earnest. "You've been given a second chance here, son. Don't waste it out of fear or pride. If that Apache chief sees something in you worth helping, maybe you should see it too." That night, Zeke slept in the bunkhouse with the ranch hands. They treated him with the easy camaraderie of working cowboys, asked no prying questions, shared their tobacco and stories. It reminded him of who he'd been once, before loss had hollowed him out. He fell asleep to the sound of men talking quietly, the smell of hay and horses, and for once he didn't dream of the dead. He left at first light. With payment for the delivery in his pocket and provisions Emma had insisted on packing. The ride back toward Redemption Springs gave him time to think, though his thoughts went in circles. 200 horses. A chance to rebuild. But rebuild what? The ranch was gone, sold to pay debts he could barely remember incurring in his grief-stricken fog. The life he'd had was as dead as Sarah and the girls, or was it? Tarak had said something about choice, about purpose, and he'd mentioned his own loss, a wife, a child, gone 5 years. Yet he was still here, still leading his people, still raising his daughters. He'd found a way to carry grief without letting it destroy him. Maybe that was the real gift, not the horses, but the reminder that life could continue. That meaning could be found again, even after everything fell apart. By the second evening, Zeke made camp within sight of Redemption Springs. He could see the lights of the town twinkling in the gathering darkness, and beyond it, the glow of campfires where Tarak's band had made their temporary camp. Tomorrow would be the 3rd day. Tomorrow, he'd have to give his answer. He built a small fire and made coffee, sitting with his back against his saddle. His father's saddle, the one piece of his past he'd refused to let go. He ran his hand over the worn leather, feeling the tool designs, the maker's mark. His father had believed in honest work, in keeping your word, in standing by your principles even when it was hard. What would his father say now? What would Sarah say? What would Lily and Rose want for him? He thought about Ayana and Elu, the way they'd looked at him with such solemn gratitude. He thought about Tarek, who'd lost as much as Zeke had, but still found the strength to go on, to lead, to love his remaining family fiercely. He thought about Pete and Maria, who'd stood by him through his worst years, never judging, always offering kindness he hadn't earned. And he thought about the eagle feather in his pocket, a symbol of honor he didn't quite believe he deserved. The stars came out, brilliant and cold. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called. Zeke poured himself another cup of coffee and made his decision. Not because he was certain it was right, but because staying afraid forever wasn't living. It was just a different kind of death. Come morning, he would ride into Redemption Springs. He would find Tarek, and he would accept not just the horses, but everything that came with them, the responsibility, the uncertainty, the terrifying possibility of hope. He would try to rebuild. Not the life he'd had, because that was gone forever, but maybe something new, something that honored the memory of what he'd lost without being imprisoned by it. The fire burned low. Zeke added more wood and watched the flames catch and grow. Tomorrow was the third day. Tomorrow, everything would change. And for the first time in 15 years, Ezekiel Ward was ready. Redemption Springs had never looked so different, and so exactly the same as when Zeke rode in that third morning. The town itself hadn't changed. Same dusty street, same weathered buildings leaning slightly in the wind. But Zeke had changed, and that made everything feel new and strange. Tarek's camp was set up a quarter-mile outside town, a respectful distance that allowed for coexistence without tension. When Zeke rode up, warriors nodded to him in acknowledgement. Word had spread, it seemed. He was the man who'd saved the chief's daughters. He was owed respect. Tarek emerged from a large hide tent, Ayana and Elu at his heels. The girls brightened when they saw Zeke and ran to him, chattering in Apache. He caught words he was learning: uncle, friend, horses. Their joy was uncomplicated, innocent. It made his chest ache with memory and something else, something that might have been healing. "You have thought on my offer," Tarek said, approaching with that same measured dignity. "It wasn't a question." "I have." Zeke dismounted, removed his hat out of respect. "I want to accept your help. Not just the horses, the whole thing. I want to try to rebuild my life here in Redemption Springs. I don't know if I can do it, but I want to try." Tarek studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Good. This is the harder path, but the one with more meaning." He gestured toward the herd grazing nearby, watched over by several young warriors. "These horses are yours, but before you sell them, we must teach you their value. Apache horses are trained different than white man's horses. They are worth more than you think." Over the next few hours, Tarek walked Zeke through the herd, pointing out bloodlines, training, temperament. These weren't just random horses. They were carefully bred and trained animals, worth far more than the $20 a head Zeke had estimated. Some were trained for warfare, quick, responsive, fearless. Others were bred for endurance, capable of covering vast distances on minimal water. Still others were gentle enough for children, but smart enough to find their way home across unfamiliar territory. "Like Mercy, you sell these to men who understand," Tarek advised. "Not to men who see only that they come from Apache. Some men will refuse to buy because of pride. Those men are fools, and you do not need their money." They selected 50 horses to start with, a mix of types, ages, and training levels. Zeke would keep the others in reserve, build a corral, start a legitimate horse trading and training operation. It was ambitious. It was terrifying. It was more than he'd dared hope for in years. That afternoon, Zeke went to see Mr. Thornton at the bank. The man looked up from his ledger when Zeke entered, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. "Zeke Ward, heard you'd come into some good fortune." Thornton was in his 50s, well-fed and prosperous, with soft hands and eyes that never quite met yours directly. "Apache horses, they say. Quite a story. I need to discuss terms for purchasing land," Zeke said, keeping his voice level. I want to start a horse operation. Need grazing land, corral space, maybe a small barn. Thornton leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. That's so. And you think you can just walk in here after 15 years of barely scraping by and expect credit? I'm not asking for credit. I have horses to sell for cash. I want to know what land is available and at what price. Thornton's expression was carefully neutral, but Zeke saw the wheels turning. There's the old Henderson place. 20 acres on the south edge of town. But I don't know, Zeke. Apache horses. Folks around here might not take kindly to that. Could be trouble. The horses are solid stock, well trained. Any horseman with half a brain can see their quality. It's not about quality. Thornton's voice dropped, confidential but edged with something like warning. It's about perception. People see Apache, they think trouble. They remember the wars. You start bringing Indian horses into town regular-like, setting up business with them, you might find folks less than welcoming. Zeke held his gaze. Are you refusing to sell me land, Mr. Thornton? I'm advising you to think carefully. That's all. Thornton's smile didn't reach his eyes. Besides, there's the matter of your previous debts. You never fully settled what you owed when your family passed. I'd need to review those accounts before considering any new business arrangements. The room seemed to tilt. I sold everything I owned to pay those debts. The ranch, the cattle, everything. Did you? My records show otherwise. But like I said, I'd need to review. Thornton returned to his ledger, a dismissal. Come back in a few days. We'll talk more when I've had time to verify a few things. Zeke left the bank with his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. On the boardwalk outside, he nearly ran into Deputy Clayton, who gave him a long, unfriendly look. Heard you're in business with the Apache now? Clayton said. He was young, maybe 30, with ambitious eyes and a mean streak he kept barely concealed. That true? I'm starting a horse operation. The horses happen to come from Tarek's band. Folks don't like Indians in town, Zeke. Just a friendly warning. Clayton's hand rested on his gun belt, casual but pointed. Could be trouble. For everyone. Zeke walked away without responding, his earlier hope curdling into frustration. He found old Pete at the general store and told him what had happened. Pete listened, his expression darkening. Thornton's up to something, Pete said. Always has been. And Clayton does whatever Thornton wants. They've got some arrangement, everyone knows it. He paused, considering. But you've got friends too, Zeke, don't forget that. That evening, Maria invited Zeke to eat at the cantina. Word had spread fast about his good fortune, and the dinner crowd was larger than usual, many of them curious about the Apache horses and the man who'd suddenly become somebody again. Some folks were friendly, asking genuine questions about the horses. Others kept their distance, watching with suspicion. Zeke ate his meal quietly, feeling the weight of eyes on him. This was what rebuilding would look like, constant judgment, constant skepticism. The town that had pitied him as a broken man now distrusted him as one who'd found fortune through Apache connections. As he left the cantina, he saw it. Someone had smashed a window at old Pete's store and painted on the wall in crude letters, "No Indians." Pete was already there with a bucket of water and a brush, scrubbing at the paint. "Don't worry about it," he said when Zeke approached. "Just small minds and big fears. Always has been that way. This is because of me. Because I'm working with Tarek. This is because some folks can't stand seeing things change." Pete dunked the brush again, kept scrubbing. "You do what's right, Zeke. The rest will sort itself out." But as Zeke walked back to where he'd made camp on the edge of town, not quite welcome in his own community, not quite belonging to Tarek's, he wondered if Pete was right, or if trying to rebuild here, in a town that might never accept him, was just another kind of mistake. The days that followed were a study in persistence. Zeke managed to purchase the Henderson place, not through Thornton, who continued to stall, but through a direct arrangement with Henderson's widow, who lived in Santa Fe. She was happy to sell to someone who'd use the land rather than let it sit fallow. It wasn't much. 20 acres of scrubland with a broken-down corral and a lean-to that barely qualified as a barn. But it was his. For the first time in 15 years, Ezekiel Ward owned property again. Tarek's warriors helped him rebuild the corral, their labor swift and efficient. They worked in a different rhythm than white cowboys, with less talking and more instinctive coordination. Zeke found himself learning from them. Better ways to set posts, how to use the natural landscape for shelter, techniques for calming fractious horses that he'd never encountered before. Ayana and Elu came every day, sometimes with their father, sometimes with a warrior escort. They'd taken to calling Zeke uncle in English, and he found himself looking forward to their visits. They reminded him of his daughters, yes, but they were also wholly themselves. Ayana with her serious questions and careful observations, Elu with her quick laughter and fearless way with the horses. One afternoon, Ayana presented him with something wrapped in soft leather. "For you," she said in careful English, "from our mother's belongings." Inside was a small wooden music box, worn smooth with age and handling. When Zeke opened it, a delicate melody played, something European, maybe a waltz. His hands trembled. He'd owned a music box like this once. Sarah had kept it on the mantel, and the girls had loved to wind it up and dance to its tinkling song. He'd sold it to pay for medicine during the fever, sold it to a pawn shop in town for $5. "This is too precious," he started to say, but Ayana shook her head. "Our mother loved music," she said. "Father says you lost your family to fever. We lost our mother too. This connects us." She touched the box gently. "Now you keep it. Remember your daughters, but also remember you have us now." The simple honesty of it, the generous spirit, nearly undid him. He managed to thank her, his voice rough, and she smiled. A rare, beautiful smile that reminded him how young she still was, despite her solemn bearing. But not everything was healing and progress. The vandalism continued. Another window broken at Pete's store. Someone set fire to a section of Zeke's new corral, though they caught it in time, and the damage was minimal. Angry whispers followed him through town. Deputy Clayton watched his every move, with barely concealed hostility. The turning point came when Zeke tried to sell his first horses. He'd selected 5 of the finest animals, a pair of matching greys trained for driving, a flashy pinto with excellent conformation, and 2 solid working horses any rancher would be proud to own. He put out word through Pete's store, set up a proper showing at his corral. 7 men showed up. 4 left without even looking at the horses once they learned they were Apache trained. Of the remaining 3, 2 made insultingly low offers, clearly expecting Zeke to be desperate enough to accept. The third, a rancher named Morrison from 30 miles out, actually examined the horses properly. "These are fine animals," Morrison said, running expert hands down the pinto's legs, checking teeth, watching the horse's movement. "Better than fine. Where'd the Apache learn to train like this?" "They've been breeding and training horses for generations," Zeke said, "long before white folks came to this territory. They know things we forgot or never learned." Morrison nodded slowly. "I'll give you 50 for the pinto. Fair price for a horse this good." It was more than fair, it was generous. Zeke accepted, and Morrison paid in gold coin, counted out carefully. As he led the pinto away, he paused. "Word of advice, Ward. You've got quality here, but you'll never get fair value selling in Redemption Springs. These folks are too set in their prejudices. You want real buyers, you need to go wider. Maybe up to Santa Fe or over to Albuquerque. Places where businessmen care more about quality than politics." That night, Zeke shared this advice with Tarek over a fire at the Apache camp. They'd fallen into a routine of evening conversations, often with Ayana translating when Tarek wanted to convey something complex in his own language. The chief listened carefully, then nodded. "Morrison speaks wisdom. But there is another path." Tarek poked at the fire with a stick. "Make your land a place where both worlds meet. Some white men will come because the horses are good. Some Apache will come because you are trusted. Over time, the meeting place becomes normal. Becomes accepted. That could take years, and I might lose everything before then if I can't sell enough horses to survive. You will not lose everything. We will help. This is not charity, it is investment. You become bridge between peoples. That has value beyond gold." Tarek fixed him with that penetrating gaze. "But you must be strong. Your own people will test you, will try to make you choose sides. You must refuse to choose. You must stand in the middle and say both sides have value. It was easy philosophy to speak by firelight, harder to live in daylight. But Zeke was beginning to understand that Tarek wasn't just helping him rebuild a horse operation. He was helping him rebuild himself, not as the man he'd been before, but as something new. Someone who'd been broken down so completely, he could be rebuilt different. A few days later, Zeke received a message to meet at Maria's cantina. When he arrived, he found Pete, Maria, and 3 other townspeople waiting. The schoolteacher, Mrs. Henley, the blacksmith, Tom Wilson, and surprisingly, Morrison, who'd ridden back into town. "We've been talking," Pete said without preamble, "about what's happening in this town. The vandalism, the prejudice, Clayton's threats. It's not right, and more importantly, it's not smart. You're trying to build something good here, Zeke, something that could benefit everyone if we let it," Morrison spoke up. "I told a few ranchers I trust about your horses. They're interested, but they won't come to Redemption Springs if there's trouble. Bad for business." He leaned forward. "So here's what I'm proposing. Monthly horse fair, out at your place. Open to buyers from all over. We spread the word it's legitimate, quality stock, and we make sure there's no trouble. A few of us stand with you, show it's not just an Apache operation, it's a community thing. People who want to cause problems will think twice if it's not just you alone out there," Mrs. Henley added. "There's more of us than there are of them, Zeke. We just need to stop being quiet about it." Zeke looked around the table at these faces. Some he'd known for years, others who were newer to his life. They were offering to stand with him, to risk their own reputations and possibly their safety, because they believed what he was doing mattered. "I don't know what to say," he managed. "Say you'll let us help," Maria said firmly. "Say you'll stop trying to do everything alone." So he did. And for the first time since this all began, Zeke felt like maybe he wasn't just surviving. Maybe he was actually building something that could last, something worth the trouble. It was a Sunday morning when Zeke found the papers. He'd been sorting through his few belongings, looking for an old map he remembered having, when his hand touched the bottom of his saddlebag and found an oilskin packet he'd forgotten was there. He pulled it out, the leather crackling with age, and opened it carefully. Inside were documents. His marriage certificate, Sarah's death notice, the girls' birth certificates, and beneath those, something he'd shoved away and tried to forget, papers related to his ranch. Debt notices, bills of sale, and at the bottom the original land deed. His land deed! Zeke's hands began to shake as he studied it. The deed was dated 1875, filed with the Territorial Land Office, signed and sealed. 640 acres, purchased fair and square with money he'd saved for 5 years before marrying Sarah. The boundaries were marked clearly: north to Devil's Creek, south to the old Mission Road, east to the granite outcropping, west to the cottonwood stand. But there was something wrong. He pulled out the bill of sale Thornton had given him during those terrible, grief-stricken weeks after Sarah died. The paper that said he'd sold the ranch to settle his debts. The signatures looked right. The date made sense. But when he compared the legal descriptions, his heart nearly stopped. They didn't match. The bill of sale described a different parcel entirely. Similar boundaries, but off by enough to matter. The granite outcropping on the deed was described as Red Rock Formation on the sale. The cottonwood stand was listed as Western Boundary Marker Tree. It was close enough that a grieving, desperate man wouldn't have noticed. Close enough that it might have been an honest mistake by a clerk. But Zeke had spent enough time reading legal documents back when he was a prosperous rancher to know this was wrong. The land he'd supposedly sold wasn't the land he actually owned. He sat there for a long moment, documents spread around him, trying to make sense of it. If the sale was for different land, then legally he'd never sold his ranch at all. He'd signed away property he didn't own, which meant the transaction was invalid, which meant his ranch still belonged to him. Zeke's first thought was that it had to be a mistake. But as he looked closer at the paperwork, at Thornton's signature on the bill of sale, at the specific wording chosen, doubt crept in. Thornton was too careful, too meticulous to make this kind of error accidentally. And if it was deliberate, that meant during Zeke's darkest hour, the banker had stolen his land through legal manipulation. He gathered the papers and went straight to old Pete, who'd been a witness to some of the original transactions. Pete put on his reading glasses and studied the documents for nearly an hour, cross-referencing, comparing, his expression growing grimmer. "This is fraud," Pete said finally. "Pure and simple. You never legally sold your ranch, Zeke. Thornton took it from you while you were too grief-stricken to notice the discrepancy." He looked up, anger flashing in his usually gentle eyes. "Who owns it now? Who's working that land?" "I don't know. After Sarah died, I never went back. Couldn't bear to see it. We need to find out." Pete stood, already reaching for his coat. "And we need to do it quiet-like, before Thornton gets wind that you've figured this out." They rode out that afternoon. Zeke, Pete, and Tom Wilson, the blacksmith, who'd offered to come along. The ranch was a 2-hour ride north of town, through terrain Zeke had once known like the back of his hand. As they got closer, memories came flooding back. That bend in the creek where he'd proposed to Sarah, the flat meadow where the girls had learned to ride, the hill where he'd planned to build a bigger house someday. When they crested the final rise, Zeke pulled Mercy to a stop and just stared. His ranch, his land, but not as he'd left it. Someone had rebuilt extensively. The original ranch house, the one he'd built with his own hands, was gone, replaced by a larger structure. New corrals, a proper barn, even a bunkhouse. Cattle grazed in the pastures, maybe 200 head. And in the yard, moving between buildings, men worked at various tasks. This wasn't abandoned property. This was an active, prosperous ranch. "That's Wade Thornton," Tom said, pointing to a man on horseback supervising some fence work. "The banker's nephew. I heard he'd set up a cattle operation north of town, but I didn't know it was here." Wade Thornton. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Mr. Thornton hadn't just stolen Zeke's land through fraud. He'd given it to family. They'd probably planned it from the start, waiting for tragedy to give them the opportunity. "What are you going to do?" Pete asked quietly. Zeke stared at the ranch that should have been his, at the life someone else was living on land he'd paid for with his sweat and dreams. Rage burned in his chest, hot and righteous. But beneath it was something colder, sharper, a need for justice that went beyond anger. "I'm going to get it back," he said. "Legal and proper, the same way it was taken from me, through the law." They rode back to town and went straight to Maria's cantina. By evening, they'd gathered everyone who'd stood with Zeke before, plus a few others who'd heard about the discovery. Morrison had ridden in from his ranch. Mrs. Henley brought her late husband's old law books. Even a few of Tarek's warriors showed up, alerted by the tension in town. When Tarek himself arrived, he listened to the whole story in silence, his expression growing darker. When Zeke finished, the chief spoke in Apache, harsh and emphatic. Ayana translated, her young voice struggling with the weight of his words. "My father says this is the worst kind of theft. To steal from a man in grief is like killing a wounded warrior. There is no honor in it. In Apache law, this would be punished severely." She paused, then added in her own voice, "He wants to know if you need warriors to take back what's yours." "No," Zeke said firmly, though he was touched by the offer. "This has to be done legal. If I take it by force, I'm no better than Thornton. And it'll give Clayton and others the excuse they need to cause real trouble for your people." "Then what?" Morrison asked. "You can't just walk into the bank and show Thornton these papers. He'll find a way to make them disappear or claim they're forgeries." Mrs. Henley, who'd been studying the documents, spoke up. "We need copies. Multiple copies, witnessed and notarized. We need to file the original deed with the Territorial Land Office, not just the local office, but the main office in Santa Fe. Create a paper trail so thorough he can't erase it." She looked at Zeke over her reading glasses. "And we need to do it fast, before he realizes what we're doing." "There's something else," Pete said grimly. "Deputy Clayton. He's in Thornton's pocket. If this goes to law, Clayton will do everything he can to protect his benefactor. We might need to go over his head, bring in the territorial marshal." The planning went late into the night. They would send Morrison to Santa Fe tomorrow with copies of all documents. Mrs. Henley would research the exact legal process for contesting fraudulent land sales. Pete would quietly gather witnesses who remembered Zeke's original purchase. And Zeke would confront Wade Thornton at the ranch, but not alone. They'd go as a group, witnesses to whatever happened. Through it all, Tarek sat silent, watching. When the others began to disperse, he pulled Zeke aside. "You have learned something important," the chief said. "When you found my daughters, you gave everything because it was right, with no thought of reward. Now you are given chance to take back what was stolen. This is balance, the world correcting itself." He gripped Zeke's shoulder. "But be careful. Desperate men do desperate things. Thornton will not give up his theft easily, I know. But I can't let it stand. It's not just about the land anymore. It's about—" Zeke struggled to find words. "Justice," Tarek finished. "And honor, yes, these things matter more than property. But sometimes, to get them, you must risk everything again." He paused, then added, "My warriors will watch. Not to fight your battle, but to make sure it stays a battle of law and not something worse. Is this acceptable?" "It's more than acceptable. It's appreciated." As Zeke lay in his bedroll that night, he couldn't sleep. His mind churned through possibilities, dangers, outcomes. Somewhere out there, Wade Thornton slept in a house built on Zeke's land, with cattle bearing his brand on Zeke's grass, living a life that should have been Zeke's to rebuild. Tomorrow, it would all come to a head. Tomorrow, he'd ride out there with witnesses and proof and demand what was rightfully his. And whatever happened after that, whatever came of confronting the Thorntons and risking everything he'd begun to rebuild, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was done walking away, done accepting loss, done letting others define what he deserved. If 15 years of grief had taught him anything, it was that life could strip away everything you loved in a heartbeat. But it had also taught him that as long as you were still breathing, there was a chance to stand up and fight back, and that's exactly what he intended to do. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of morning that made the desert air sharp as glass in your lungs. Zeke was up before the sun, checking Mercy's tack, organizing the documents he'd carry in his saddlebag. His hands were steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through him. This was it, the moment that would determine not just ownership of land, but whether justice still meant something in a world that often felt lawless and cruel. Pete arrived first, riding an old bay gelding that had seen better days, but was solid enough for the journey. Then Tom Wilson on his draft horse, a massive animal built for pulling plows, but gentle as a kitten. Mrs. Henley came in a small buggy, her late husband's law books packed carefully beside her. Morrison rode in from his ranch with two of his hands, men he trusted, he'd said, who wouldn't be intimidated by threats or bribes. And from the Apache camp came Tarek with 4 of his best warriors. They were armed, which caused Morrison's men to exchange nervous glances, but Tarek had been clear about their role. "We are witnesses," he'd said. "Nothing more unless violence is begun by others. Then we protect those who stand for justice." The group made an unusual sight as they rode north. Cowboys and Apache, townspeople and outsiders, all united around one weathered man who was reclaiming his past. Zeke felt the weight of their support like a physical thing, grounding him. He wasn't alone anymore, hadn't been alone since the day he'd given mercy to 2 dying girls. As they rode, Zeke found himself riding alongside Tarek. The chief was quiet, watching the landscape with the alertness of a man who'd survived by reading every shift in wind and shadow. Finally he spoke. "When I lost my wife, I wanted to die. For many moons, I did not care if I lived or saw another sunrise. My daughters needed me, but I could not reach past my grief to care for them properly." He paused, his face grave. "Then one day Elu fell from her horse, broke her arm. She cried for her mother, but her mother was dust. She had only me. And I realized grief is not dishonor to the dead, but failing the living because you are trapped in grief, that is dishonor." Zeke understood what Tarek was really saying, that this fight today wasn't just about land or justice. It was about proving he could still act, still matter, still be someone the living could depend on. It was about breaking free from the prison of loss. Thank you, Zeke said quietly. For understanding. We understand each other. This is why I help, Tarek glanced at him. But also because you earned it. When you gave my daughters your horse, you proved your spirit was not broken, only buried. Today you dig it up completely. They reached the ranch just as the sun climbed over the eastern hills, painting everything gold. Zeke's heart lurched at the sight of it in full daylight. The rebuilt ranch house was handsome, well constructed, with a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. Smoke rose from the chimney. Horses moved in the corrals. Everything about it spoke of prosperity and permanence. Someone else's prosperity, built on his loss. Wade Thornton emerged from the house as they rode up, alerted by the sound of so many horses. He was in his early 30s, tall and solid, with his uncle's calculating eyes, but more physical presence. He carried himself like a man who'd never been seriously challenged. And when he saw the size of the group approaching, confusion flickered across his face before hardening into suspicion. "Zeke Ward," he called out, his hand drifting toward the gun at his hip. "That's quite a party you've brought. What's this about?" Ranch hands emerged from the barn and bunkhouse, drawn by the commotion. Zeke counted 6 men, all armed. But his own group numbered 9, plus Tarek's 4 warriors. And there was something in their unified presence that gave Wade pause. Zeke dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible and away from his own weapon. Pete, Tom, and Morrison followed suit. The Apache remained mounted, silent and imposing. "This is about the land you're standing on," Zeke said, his voice carrying clear in the morning air. "This ranch, these 640 acres. They belong to me, and I have the paperwork to prove it." Wade's expression twisted between anger and disbelief. "What the hell are you talking about? My uncle bought this property 15 years ago from you, fair and square." "No, he didn't." Zeke pulled the documents from his saddlebag and held them up. "He bought different property. Similar description, wrong boundaries. The deed I hold is the original, filed with the Territorial Land Office in 1875. The land I actually owned, this land, was never legally sold. Which means you're squatting on my property. That's insane." "You're lying." But Wade's voice held a note of uncertainty now. He'd probably never even seen the original paperwork, just trusted his uncle's word that everything was legal. Mrs. Henley spoke up from her buggy, her voice calm and authoritative. "I've reviewed the documents, Mr. Thornton. Mr. Ward is correct. The legal description on the bill of sale doesn't match the legal description on the original deed. The transaction was fraudulent, whether deliberately or through error. Either way, the land was never properly conveyed. You're a school teacher, not a lawyer." Wade shot back. "My late husband was a lawyer for 30 years. I know how to read a land deed." She produced a thick book from her buggy. "I also know territorial law. Chapter 14, Section 6. A sale of property is void if the legal description does not accurately identify the property in question." "Would you like me to read it aloud?" Wade's face had gone pale. Behind him, his ranch hands exchanged worried glances. Whatever they were being paid, it probably wasn't enough to defend stolen property. "This is ridiculous," Wade said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Even if what you're saying is true, and I'm not admitting it is, this land has been worked and improved for 15 years. That counts for something." "It counts for theft," Tarek said, speaking for the first time. His voice was quiet, but carried an edge like sharpened stone. "In my people's law, this would mean death or permanent exile. You live on another man's grief, profit from his loss. This is the act of a coward and a thief. I don't need some Indian telling me about law," Wade snapped. Then immediately looked like he regretted it, as Tarek's warriors shifted slightly, their weapons suddenly more visible. "Easy," Morrison said, stepping between them. "Nobody here wants violence. This is about establishing the truth. Wait, I've known you since you were a boy. If you didn't know about the fraud, that's one thing. But you need to hear what these people are saying. Look at the documents yourself." For a moment it seemed like Wade might refuse. Then he took a step forward, and Zeke met him halfway, holding out the papers. Wade read them slowly, his jaw working. Zeke watched him closely and saw the moment comprehension hit. The realization that his uncle had lied to him, used him, built his prosperity on fraud. Son of a... Wade breathed, then looked up at Zeke. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Uncle Marcus told me he'd bought this place legal, that you'd been happy to sell it to settle your debts. Maybe you didn't know, Zeke said. But your uncle did. And now you have a choice. You can do the right thing and acknowledge this land is mine, or you can double down on theft and force this into court, where you'll lose, and lose everything, Pete added. Because once this comes out, everyone's going to wonder what else Marcus Thornton has stolen through legal manipulation. The bank will be ruined, and you'll be ruined with it. Wade looked around at the ranch he'd built, at the life he'd created. Zeke felt an unexpected flicker of sympathy. Wade had been a tool in his uncle's scheme, probably manipulated as much as Zeke himself had been. But sympathy didn't change the facts. This was Zeke's land, his life, his chance at redemption. Before Wade could respond, the sound of approaching horses made everyone turn. Deputy Clayton rode up with 3 other men, hired guns by the look of them, rough characters who made their living with violence. Clayton's expression was smug as he took in the scene. Heard there might be trouble out here, he said, reining in his horse. Looks like I heard right. You all are on private property. I suggest you leave before I arrest the lot of you for trespassing. We're not trespassing, Pete said firmly. This is Zeke Ward's land, and we have the documents to prove it. Documents can be forged. I say you're trespassing. Clayton's hand rested on his gun. Now mount up and ride out, or we'll have a problem. The tension ratcheted up instantly. Morrison's men shifted, hands moving toward weapons. Tarek's warriors made no move at all, which somehow made them more threatening. Wade's ranch hands backed away, clearly wanting no part of a gunfight. Mrs. Henley climbed down from her buggy and stood with surprising courage next to Zeke. Her chin raised defiantly. I know what you're doing, Clayton, she said. Marcus Thornton sent you here to protect his interests. But you're a peace officer. Your job is to uphold the law, not defend fraud. My job is to keep the peace. And right now, these people are causing trouble. Clayton's eyes were cold. Last chance. Leave now, or what? The voice came from behind Clayton, and everyone turned. A man on horseback sat at the edge of the yard, someone none of them had heard approach. He wore a territorial marshal's badge on his chest and carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd faced down worse than a deputy on the take and some hired guns. Clayton's face went white. Marshal Crawford, what are you doing here? Received an interesting telegram yesterday, Crawford said, riding forward slowly, from a rancher named Morrison, describing possible fraud in a land transaction and a local deputy who might be compromised. Thought I'd ride down and see for myself. He looked at Zeke. You must be Ezekiel Ward. I'd like to see those documents, if you don't mind. Zeke handed them over, his heart pounding. Crawford read carefully, then looked at the ranch, then back at the papers. Finally he nodded and handed them back. These appear legitimate. I'll need to verify with the land office in Santa Fe, but on the face of it, you've got a strong claim. He turned to Wade. Mr. Thornton, I strongly suggest you cooperate with Mr. Ward until this can be properly adjudicated. Attempting to defend possession of potentially fraudulent property could land you in serious legal trouble. I understand, Wade said quietly. He looked at Zeke. I want to see my uncle first, hear his side of this. But if what you're saying is true, if he really did steal your land, then I won't fight you on it. I won't be party to that. It wasn't complete capitulation, but it was something, more than Zeke had hoped for. He nodded acknowledgement. Crawford turned his attention to Clayton. As for you, Deputy, we're going to have a long conversation about your conduct. Dismount and surrender your weapon. You can't, Clayton started, but one look at Crawford's expression silenced him. The hired guns he'd brought melted away, wanting no part of federal law enforcement. Clayton dismounted slowly, his face a mask of impotent rage. The confrontation that could have ended in bloodshed had been diffused. But Zeke knew this was just the beginning. Thornton wouldn't give up without a fight. Wade might not defend the property, but his uncle would use every legal trick available. This would get worse before it got better. Still, as the sun climbed higher and his allies gathered around him, Zeke felt something unfamiliar settling into his bones. Hope, real, tangible hope that justice might actually prevail, that the life stolen from him could be reclaimed, that the man he'd been, strong, capable, worthy, wasn't lost forever after all. By noon, word had spread through Redemption Springs like wildfire. The confrontation at the ranch, Marshal Crawford's arrival, Deputy Clayton's arrest, everyone was talking. And everyone knew that the real showdown was yet to come. Marcus Thornton sat in his bank behind his polished desk, his face pale but composed. When Zeke walked in with Marshal Crawford, Pete, and Morrison, the banker didn't even pretend surprise. He simply folded his hands on the desk and waited. "Mr. Thornton," Crawford said, settling into a chair without invitation. "I believe you know why we're here." "I can imagine." Thornton's voice was steady, but Zeke saw the calculation in his eyes. The man was already thinking 3 moves ahead, looking for angles, loopholes, ways to wriggle free. "Though I'm not sure what gives a territorial marshal jurisdiction over a simple property dispute between private citizens. Fraud makes it federal business, especially when it involves a county official, Deputy Clayton, who appears to have been taking bribes to protect criminal activity." Crawford pulled out the documents and spread them on the desk. "These tell an interesting story, Mr. Thornton. Care to explain the discrepancy between Mr. Ward's original deed and the bill of sale you drew up?" Thornton barely glanced at the papers. "Clerical error, obviously." "These things happen." Land descriptions can be confusing, especially in territories where boundaries aren't always clearly marked. "I'm sure if we review the records, we already have," Pete interrupted, his voice hard. "I've spent the last 2 days going through every document related to that sale. You knew exactly what you were doing. You changed the legal description deliberately, counting on Zeke being too grief-stricken to notice. You stole his land when he was at his most vulnerable. That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof of intent?" "We have this." Morrison produced another document, laying it carefully on the desk. It was a letter yellowed with age, bearing Thornton's signature. "I've found it in the county clerk's office. A letter from you to the clerk, dated 3 weeks before Zeke's family died, inquiring about the legal process for acquiring property from distressed owners, specifically mentioning Zeke's ranch as premium land that would be available soon." Thornton's composure cracked, just slightly. His eyes darted to the letter, then away. "That proves nothing. I was simply conducting business inquiries. 3 weeks before the fever hit." Mrs. Henley, who'd followed them in, stepped forward. "You couldn't have known the fever was coming. Unless you're suggesting you have prophetic abilities, Mr. Thornton. What you did know was that Zeke was already struggling with debts. You were planning to take advantage of his situation. The fever just gave you an opportunity sooner than expected, and a bigger one," Zeke said quietly. All eyes turned to him. He'd been silent until now, letting others make the case. But this he needed to say himself. A man in debt is one thing. A man destroyed by grief is another. "You waited until I'd buried my wife and daughters. Until I was so broken I could barely function. Then you came to me with papers and sympathy, talking about how you wanted to help me, how selling the ranch would let me start fresh somewhere else." His voice remained steady, but the rage beneath it was palpable. "I trusted you, Marcus. I signed whatever you put in front of me because I couldn't see straight from crying, and you used that trust to steal everything I had left." Thornton's mask slipped further. Anger flashed across his face, quickly suppressed, but not before everyone saw it. "You had debts, Ward, real debts. I was simply collecting what was owed." "Show us those debts," Marshal Crawford's voice cut like a knife. "Itemized, with documentation. I'd have to review my records, then review them. Now, we'll wait." For the first time, real fear showed in Thornton's eyes. He stood slowly, moved to a filing cabinet, and began pulling documents with trembling hands. As he sorted through papers, Zeke saw the man's carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Whatever debts Thornton produced, if any were legitimate, wouldn't be enough to justify what he'd done. "The thing is," Zeke said softly, I don't even care about the money anymore. You took my land, yeah, but more than that, you took my dignity. You kicked a man when he was down and made him feel like he deserved it, like losing everything was somehow his fault. For 15 years I've carried that shame. Believed I was worthless because I had nothing. He stepped closer to the desk, and Thornton actually flinched back. But Zeke didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. The truth was weapon enough, but I'm not worthless. I never was. And what you did wasn't justice or business. It was theft, pure and simple. You're a thief, Marcus. A coward who preys on people's grief. And everyone in this room knows it now. Thornton's hands had stopped moving through the papers. He stood there, exposed and trapped, his reputation unraveling with every passing second. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. What do you want? I want my land back. I want my name cleared. And I want everyone to know what you did. Zeke paused, then added, but I'm not going to ask for vengeance. That would make me like you. The law will handle what happens next. Marshal Crawford stood, his expression grim. Marcus Thornton, I'm placing you under arrest for fraud, theft by deception, and conspiracy. You have the right to... Wait. Wade Thornton appeared in the doorway, his expression haunted. He held something in his hands, a small wooden box, ornate and old. I went to my uncle's house, found this in his safe. I think you need to see what's inside. He opened the box, and Zeke's breath caught. Inside was a woman's wedding ring, delicate gold with a small diamond. Sarah's ring. The one he'd pawned for $5 to buy medicine that hadn't saved her, and beneath it, a watch, silver, engraved with his father's initials. A pocket watch Zeke thought he'd lost years ago. Had probably pawned it too, in that grief-stricken blur of desperate days. There's more, Wade said quietly. Other items, things taken from people over the years, kept like trophies. He looked at his uncle with disgust. You didn't just steal land. You stole memories, pieces of people's lives. Thornton sank into his chair, all fight gone out of him. The game was over, and he knew it. Zeke reached into the box with trembling fingers and lifted out Sarah's ring. It caught the light from the window, the small diamond sparkling just as it had on their wedding day. He closed his fist around it, feeling the weight of it, the reality of it. This ring had circled her finger for 12 years. She'd worn it while cooking breakfast, while braiding the girl's hair, while reaching for his hand across the table. And Thornton had kept it, not for its monetary value. The thing was worth maybe $10. He'd kept it because it represented his power over a broken man. You're a monster, Wade said to his uncle, his voice thick with emotion. I defended you, made excuses for you, thought you were teaching me business. He set the box on the desk with careful precision. But you were just teaching me how to be a thief. Marshal Crawford moved to put restraints on Thornton, but the banker held up a hand. I'll come peacefully. There's no point in fighting anymore. He looked at Zeke, and for the first time there was something in his expression that might have been remorse, or maybe just the fear of a man facing consequences. For what it's worth, Ward, I did try to help you at first. The debts were real, but then it got easier. Taking things, convincing myself you were weak, that you deserved it, that I was just being practical. That's not an apology, Pete said coldly. That's an excuse. You're right, Thornton stood slowly. I have no excuse, and no defense. I did what I did because I could, because I wanted what was yours and saw an opportunity. He paused at the door, flanked by Crawford. The irony is I never even used most of those things. Never wore that watch or touched that ring. Just kept them locked away, proof that I'd won something. You didn't win anything, Zeke said quietly. You just stole. There's a difference. As Crawford led Thornton out, a crowd had gathered on the street. Word had spread faster than fire, and it seemed like half the town had shown up to witness the banker's fall. Some faces showed satisfaction, people who'd suspected Thornton's corruption for years. Others looked shocked, unable to reconcile the respectable banker with the thief being led away in chains. Deputy Clayton stood at the edge of the crowd, still under guard but not yet arrested. Marshal Crawford had been gathering evidence on him too, bribes, intimidation, abuse of authority. But Clayton's crimes were secondary to Thornton's, and his fate would be decided later. For now he just watched his world collapse with sullen fury. Tarek emerged from where he'd been waiting with his warriors, having deliberately stayed back during the confrontation in the bank. His presence commanded immediate attention. The crowd parted as he walked to where Zeke stood, holding his wife's ring. "In my people's way," Tarek said, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear, "this man," he gestured to where Crawford had taken Thornton, "would face severe punishment. We do not tolerate those who steal from the grieving. It is the worst kind of cowardice." He turned to Zeke. "But this is not my justice to claim. It is yours. What do you want, Ezekiel Ward?" The question hung in the air. Everyone waited. Zeke could feel the weight of their expectations, some wanting vengeance, others hoping for mercy, all curious about what a man who'd lost everything and gotten it back would demand. He looked at Sarah's ring in his palm, thought about his daughters, about 15 years of shame and poverty and believing he deserved his suffering. Thought about Thornton, who'd taken advantage of his grief and then built a life on that theft. "I want my land back," Zeke said clearly. "Legal and proper with clear title. I want the truth told. Everyone in this territory should know what happened, so it can't happen to anyone else." He paused, making sure everyone heard the next part. "But I don't want revenge. I don't want Thornton hurt or humiliated beyond what the law demands. What he did was evil, but answering evil with more evil doesn't fix anything." "That's mighty generous," someone in the crowd called out. "After what he did to you, it's not generous. It's just," Zeke struggled to find the words, "I've spent 15 years letting grief and shame eat me alive. I'm not going to spend the next 15 letting hatred do the same thing. He'll face justice." "That's enough." Wade stepped forward, his face haggard. "I'll sign whatever papers are needed to transfer the ranch back to you. All the improvements, the cattle, everything. Consider it partial restitution for what my uncle stole." He met Zeke's eyes. "I know it doesn't fix what happened, but it's something." "Thank you," Zeke said, and meant it. Wade had been used, just like him. The young man deserved a chance to make things right. Tarek nodded slowly, respect evident in his expression. This is true strength. The weak man demands blood. The strong man demands justice and moves forward. He placed a hand on Zeke's shoulder. "You honor your wife and daughters by choosing this path. By showing that their loss did not break your spirit, only buried it for a time." Marshal Crawford emerged from his office, leaving Thornton secured inside. "Mr. Ward, I'll need you to come by tomorrow to make a formal statement. But as far as I'm concerned, that land is yours. Mr. Wade Thornton has agreed to vacate the premises within the week and sign all necessary transfer documents." The crowd began to disperse, people talking excitedly about what they'd witnessed. Some came forward to shake Zeke's hand, to apologize for doubting him, to offer help with whatever came next. Pete and Maria stood close, their faces proud. Mrs. Henley dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Morrison grinned like a man who'd just won a bet he'd been hoping to lose. And through it all, Zeke stood holding Sarah's ring, the weight of it familiar and strange at once. His land was restored. His name was cleared. The man who'd stolen from him was facing justice. Everything he'd fought for had been achieved. But the real victory wasn't the land or the vindication. It was standing here, whole and unbowed, having chosen mercy when vengeance would have been easier. It was looking forward instead of back. It was being the kind of man his father would have been proud of, the kind of man Sarah had married, the kind of man his daughters would have wanted him to be. He slipped the ring onto his smallest finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years to come home. Then he looked at Tarek and smiled. A real smile, the first one in 15 years that felt like it came from somewhere deeper than politeness. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything. For believing I was worth saving." "You saved yourself," Tarek replied. "We only helped you remember how." 6 weeks later, Zeke stood on the porch of his rebuilt ranch house and watched the sun paint the desert in shades of copper and gold. The house wasn't grand. Just 3 rooms and a covered porch, but he'd built it with his own hands, with help from friends who'd shown up day after day until the work was done. Pete had contributed lumber. Tom Wilson had forged the hinges and nails. Morrison and his men had helped raise the frame. And Tarek's warriors had worked alongside them all, their different approaches to construction, creating something stronger than either culture could have built alone. The corrals were full again, not with 200 horses. He'd kept 50 of the best, and sold the rest at fair prices to buyers who recognized quality when they saw it. The money from those sales sat in a Santa Fe bank, earning interest, a cushion against hard times. But more valuable than money was what he'd built here, a ranch that served as a meeting place, a bridge between worlds that had too often seen each other as enemies. Mercy nickered from the nearest corral, and Zeke smiled at the sound. She wore a new saddle now, a gift from Tarek's people. It was a masterwork of craftsmanship, Apache beadwork, woven with traditional Western tooling, silver conchos mixed with turquoise and shell decorations. The design told a story. A buckskin horse carrying 2 children to safety, a man walking alone in the desert, and then that same man surrounded by friends, no longer alone. It was beautiful and meaningful. And every time Zeke saddled her with it, he felt the weight of what it represented. The town had changed too, slowly but surely. Old Pete's general store now carried Apache-made goods alongside the usual supplies. Woven blankets, beaded items, herbs and medicines that white doctors were finally beginning to respect. Maria's cantina had become a regular gathering place for both cultures. Her tables hosting poker games, where Apache warriors sat alongside cowboys, where differences were bridged over shared meals and careful conversation. Not everyone had come around. Some folks still muttered about Indians and troublemakers, still looked at Zeke's success with resentment, but they were fewer now, their voices quieter, drowned out by the majority who decided that prosperity was better than prejudice. The sound of approaching horses made Zeke turn. Ayana and Elu rode up the path, flanked by 2 young warriors who served as their escort. The girls had grown in these past weeks, not just in height, but in confidence. They visited 3 times a week now, and Zeke had taken to calling them his nieces. They called him Uncle Zeke, and the title warmed something in his chest that had been cold for 15 years. Uncle Zeke, Elu called out, waving enthusiastically. Father says you promised to show us how to train the new foal today. Did I now? Zeke descended the porch steps, grinning. Well, if your father says I promised, then I'd better keep my word. Ayana, always more serious, dismounted with practiced grace. We brought food from our camp. Father also sends this. She handed him a folded piece of paper. Zeke opened it to find a carefully drawn map, done in Tarek's precise hand. It showed the ranch boundaries, but also extended east and north to include Apache hunting grounds. And in the border area, Tarek had drawn a symbol Zeke had learned meant shared land. A proposal, then. A way to formalize what was already happening. Cooperation, mutual benefit, shared territory. Tell your father I'll ride out to discuss this with him tomorrow, Zeke said. And tell him yes. Whatever he's proposing, my answer is yes. They spent the afternoon with the foal, a leggy bay colt with a white star on his forehead. Zeke showed the girls how to approach gently, how to read the animal's body language, when to push and when to back off. They were natural horsewomen, both of them, with an intuitive understanding that came from growing up in a culture where horses weren't just animals, but partners. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, Zeke stood back and watched Ayana successfully lead the colt around the corral, while Elu perched on the fence, offering encouragement in Apache. Their laughter carried on the desert air, bright and unself-conscious, the kind of sound that made the world feel right. He thought about his daughters then, as he often did. But the memory didn't hurt the way it used to. Lily and Rose were gone, would always be gone. But their loss had led him to this moment, to these girls, to this life, to a purpose he'd never have found if he hadn't first lost everything. Later, after the girls had ridden home and the ranch had settled into evening quiet, Zeke saddled Mercy with her beautiful new saddle and rode out to the family cemetery on the eastern edge of his property. 3 simple markers stood there: Sarah, Lily, Rose. He'd cleaned them up, replanted wildflowers around them, made sure they were tended and remembered. He dismounted and stood before the graves, hat in his hands. The words came easier now than they had in years. "I found my way back," he told them. "Not to who I was before, that man's gone, and maybe that's all right. But I found someone I can live with being. Someone who matters again. Someone who helps instead of just surviving." He paused, then added, "I think you'd be proud." "I hope you would be." The desert wind carried his words away, and in the fading light, Zeke could almost believe he heard Sarah's voice on the breeze, telling him what she'd always said when he doubted himself. "You're stronger than you know." He rode back to the ranch as the first stars appeared. Mercy knew the way by heart now, picking her path through the twilight with easy confidence. Smoke rose from the ranch house chimney. He'd left a fire burning. Light glowed in the windows. Home. After 15 years of wandering, of being lost, of believing he had nothing worth holding on to, he finally had a home again. Not the same home. Not the same life, but something new, built on the foundation of loss and redeemed through an act of simple kindness that had somehow changed everything. He'd given away his last possession to save 2 children, and in return, he'd gotten his soul back. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what truly matters. And what mattered wasn't land or money or even justice, though those things had their place. What mattered was connection, purpose, the courage to keep going when everything seemed hopeless, the strength to choose mercy over bitterness, the wisdom to let the past rest while honoring its lessons. As Zeke unsaddled Mercy and turned her out into the pasture, he looked up at the stars beginning to fill the darkening sky. Tomorrow he'd meet with Tarek to formalize their partnership. Next week, Morrison was bringing potential buyers to see the horses. In a month, there'd be a harvest celebration, and both Apache and townsfolk had been invited. The future stretched before him, uncertain but no longer frightening. Because he knew now what he'd forgotten in his years of grief, that a man wasn't defined by what he'd lost, but by what he chose to do with what remained. And what remained was enough. More than enough, it was everything.